introduction. All the introductions I've ever been given, that's certainly the most recent. It is great to be in North Dakota, and you know, many people, we love what you're doing up here, what's going on in your state. It's a very exciting time to be in North Dakota, and I'm excited about what's going on in your state politically. And Governor Dalrymple and Betsy and Lisa, thank you so much for your work on behalf of your leadership on behalf of South Dakota or North Dakota, and we wish that you can continue good luck. And we're expecting a very, very big win in November of this year. And, those of us in South Dakota, you know, think that North Dakota during the territorial days sort of stole the capital from Yankton and put it in Bismarck. And as soon as they can do directional drilling that goes a couple hundred miles, we're going to return the favor and steal. But it's interesting what was said about having all these great governors here this evening, former governors as well, and it really is true. I mean, it's sad in a way, but it's true. When you think about the state of Illinois, you know, there's always the story that's told about the two guys that were sitting in this Illinois prison, and they're complaining about the treatment they're getting, and the one turns to the other guy and says, you know, the food was a lot better here when you were the governor. It's sad but true. But great to be with Ed and Nancy Schaefer. Governor Schaefer was a wonderful governor, as already mentioned, for your state, someone who I worked with as a freshman congressman when the floods were breaking out here in the Red River Valley, and of course had a lot of opportunity to work with him on other issues as well. He was Secretary of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., and of course Governor Hoeven. And Mikey, it's great to have you in the United States Senate. I've tried for a long time to encourage John to run for the United States Senate. He always tried to encourage me to run for governor. I think that's probably by far the better job. But anyway, I'm glad that he is where he is, because he is so solid, so sensible, so smart, and so principled. He's just a great leader for your state of North Dakota, the United States Senate. Like me and Governor Schaefer and Governor Dalrymple, John also married over his head when he married Mikey. She's been terrific, I know, First Lady for North Dakota, and it's been great having her as a spouse in the Senate. And before I go any further, let me also introduce my wife, Kimberly, who is here with me this evening. My dad told me the day I got married that a man who says he isn't afraid of his wife will lie about other things. I've always made a point of was making sure that I introduce my wife. Just got that. You know, when John Hoeven went to the United States Senate, and I know we had great approval ratings here in North Dakota. I know Governor Dalrymple has terrific approval ratings here in North Dakota too, but John joined an institution where the approval rating is now in single digits. Now think about that. We're down in the 9% range. And so he went from going, you know, having these great approval ratings, and then, in fact, when he was running for the Senate in 2010, people would ask me how that North Dakota Senate race is going to go, and I would say, John Hoeven is going to win by a bigger margin than I am, and I don't have an opponent. But anyway, he's now a member of an institution with a 9% approval rating, which John McCain always says, when you get down to that level, you're pretty much talking about paid staff and blood relatives. And I think we may be down to the paid staff level in the United States Senate. But it is great having him there, and I just want, for all of those who have us to have a hard time growing mustaches, I'm glad to see that you don't have to have a mustache to be the governor of North Dakota, Jack. We are, of course, hoping to do something about that 9% approval rating in Congress, but it's going to require that we get some reinforcements, which is why I hope you're doing everything that you can to make sure that Rick Berg comes to the United States. You've been a great job in the House of Representatives. We need him in the United States Senate. And I always tell people, when I'm talking to political audiences about the importance of this election year, to think about this question. What would a second Obama term look like? That ought to motivate everybody in this audience to get out there and work doubly hard to make sure that we elect a Republican president. But God forbid that we don't, that we end up with a second Obama term. The absolute best insurance policy we have is a Republican Senate. And it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen unless we win North Dakota. We have to have North Dakota. What's encouraging to me is how far we've come in North Dakota because of the leadership of the people in this room. If you think about it, the governor mentioned when I was elected to the Senate in 2004, there was not a single Republican from either of the Dakotas in Congress. We were 0-6 in the United States Congress from two states that people think of as being fairly conservative. Well, after the 2010 election, we picked up these two in North Dakota, and if we can get Rick over the finish line and retain the House seat here in North Dakota, we will be 5-6. And in 2014, we have a Senate race in South Dakota, and we could go from being 0-6 to being 6-0 in the United States Senate. And if we can do that, we can start governing the nation's capital like you govern the state of North Dakota, Governor. And your legislature and the team that you put together does a great job, and a lot of lessons that we can learn and apply those in Washington, D.C. You know, back in 1906, two Norwegian brothers named Nikolai and Matthew Gjelsvik came to America in support or in search of the American dream. And when they landed on the shores of America, the only English words they knew were the words apple pie and coffee, which evidently they had a lot of on the boat over. But when they got to Ellis Island, the immigration officials asked them to change their name because their name, Gjelsvik, was spelled G-J-E-L-S-V-I-K. And the immigration officials thought that would be too difficult to spell and pronounce for people in this country, and so they asked them to change their name. And so they thought about it, and they picked the name of the family farm near where they worked, near Bergen, Norway, and it was called the Thune Farm. And so Nikolai Gjelsvik became Nick Thune, my grandfather. And he and my great-uncle came out to the middle of South Dakota, worked on building the railroad across our state, learned English, saved up enough money to start a merchandising company, which later became a hardware store. And to this day, there is still a hardware store in Mitchell, South Dakota that bears the name Thune Hardware. The family's not associated with it anymore. But they worked hard, and they understood that if they came to this country, that this country was a land of possibilities and a land of promise. And my grandfather went on to get married and to raise his family. He raised three boys in the middle of the Great Depression. The middle son, Harold, my father, became a very accomplished basketball player, went on to star at the University of Minnesota. And when he graduated in the spring of 1942, World War II had broken out, and so he enlisted. He enlisted in the Navy, and he became a naval aviator. He got assigned to the Pacific theater of the war, and he flew an F-6F Hellcat off of the aircraft carrier Intrepid. And in one of those dogfights over modern-day Taiwan, he shot down 4 enemy aircraft, for which he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross by the commander of his carrier group, which was none other than Admiral John McCain, the grandfather of Senator John McCain. But when the war was over, my dad came back to South Dakota. He ended up back in my little town of Myrtle, population 488, where he got into the family business. At that time, my grandfather was in poor health, running a hardware store. But he and my mom started their family. They had 5 kids, and I'm the 4th of those. And I have to say, I don't think my grandfather ever would have envisioned, when he landed on the shores of America in 1906, that he would have a grandson that would have the opportunity and privilege to serve in the United States Senate. But he understood that America was a land of possibility. Anything was possible in this country if you applied yourself and worked hard. It is that American dream, ladies and gentlemen, that still motivates millions of people across this country, but which is in jeopardy if we don't make the changes that are necessary to get our country back on track. You know, and that takes strong leadership. The kind of leadership that you have here in North Dakota, and that we're missing in Washington, D.C. In fact, when I think of Washington, D.C., I'm reminded of the story about the guy who wanted to become a locomotive engineer. And so he went to the place where you get that kind of instruction. And he had an instructor who said, you gave him a problem. He said, if you had a train coming from this direction at 55 miles an hour, and another train coming from this direction at 45 miles an hour, what would you do? And the guy thought about it for a minute, and he said, well, I think I would call my brother. And his instructor said, well, that's a really strange answer. Why would you do that? He said, well, because my brother's never seen a really bad train wreck. Well, we are headed for a train wreck as a nation unless we can get this thing turned around. And Governor, you've given us a model here in North Dakota of the things that we can do on the national level if we will govern according to a set of principles and values that I think the people in this room would all endorse and subscribe to. The first of those is limited government. We foundationally believe, as conservatives, as Republicans, that the role of the government ought to be a limited one. The taxes ought to be kept low as possible. We shouldn't take any more from the American people, from the people of our states, than is absolutely necessary to run the essential functions of government. That you ought to have smart regulations, and that the policies that you put out there ought to make it easier and less difficult for people to create jobs in this country. Instead, what we have coming out of Washington, D.C. is an expanded role for the government that envisions the government taking that role and creating jobs. And that's why you had a $1 trillion stimulus in borrowed money that we handed off to our children and grandchildren, the debt of which we handed off to our children and grandchildren. A $2.7 trillion expansion of health care, a new entitlement program that we can't pay for and can't afford, in which in the end is going to end up driving up costs for people in this country. If you here in North Dakota, and I think you get this, you understand this, you have your legislature only meets every other year. You do a biennial budget. I've been advocating a biennial budget in Washington, D.C. since the time I was in the House of Representatives. Because if we did that, and we were only spending money in the odd-numbered years when people weren't running for re-election, we might have time in the even-numbered years to do the oversight that would ensure that those dollars are being spent well and efficiently and wisely. That makes sense to me. But you've got a government right now in Washington, D.C. that thinks it knows all the answers. And so you see this growing, expanding, bigger federal government. Second principle, very simple one. We believe in free enterprise and competition. That's a good thing. The jobs ought to be created out there in the private economy, not in the government economy. And we ought to be... We ought to be encouraging domestic energy development in this country, not trying to stop it. You're the great example of that here in North Dakota. Think about this. The president runs all over the country talking about how energy production is going up in this country on his watch. You know why? North Dakota. That's why. Investments in the federal lands where there is some energy development, oil and gas production under this president has gone down, and gone down by double digits. What's happening in this country that's good is happening out there in the private economy. Now, it creates challenges. I don't deny that for a minute, and I know Governor Dalrymple and his team have lots of challenges managing the explosive growth that you're seeing out there. But it is a good thing for this country when we can create jobs here at home, produce a resource here in America that meets an American need, that keeps the investment here, and lessens our dangerous dependence upon foreign sources of energy. And one of the great leaders on this issue in the United States Senate is John Thune, because he gets it. John is on the Keystone Pipeline and so many other energy issues, has become a voice and a spokesperson for reason and common sense and doing things in a practical way because he knows how to get results. He was a governor. He's worked on these issues in the past. These are the kinds of things that we ought to be doing in this country to make it easier and less difficult and less expensive for people in the private economy to create jobs and to get this economy growing and expanding again. You know, the remarkable thing about this country is we have this incredible heritage of freedom and a belief in free markets and free enterprise. We've really gotten away from that. We're sort of moving in the direction of a socialized, European-style democracy. And yet, if you look at the origin, the heritage of this country, what makes America so distinct from every other country in the world is this fundamental belief in freedom. You know, I love the story that's told about the guy back in the days of the Cold War that wanted to buy a car in the Soviet Union. So he goes into the bureau where you buy cars, and he says, I want to buy a car. And the guy at the Transportation Bureau says, well, you can have your car, and you can have your black sedan, and you can pick it up 10 years from today. And the guy says, will that be in the morning or the afternoon? And the guy at the Transportation Bureau says, well, what difference does it make? It's 10 years from now. And the guy says, well, because I got the plumber coming in the morning. You know, this model of government that we have that's based upon that fundamental principle is so unique and so different because we understand that the freedoms that we enjoy, the liberties that we enjoy, don't come to us because of the government. They aren't conferred on us by the government. They are endowed by our Creator. That is a unique and distinctive model of government in all the world, and we shouldn't get away from it, ladies and gentlemen. We've got to continue to believe and maintain those fundamental, foundational principles that are so important to the success of this great nation. Third, we believe, in addition to a belief in limited government, free enterprise, we believe in fiscal responsibility. That is you know, and that's something that all Americans ought to believe in, but I'm telling you, in Washington, D.C., we have gotten a long ways away from anything that resembles fiscal discipline or responsibility. Here in North Dakota, you balance your budget every year. That's an amazing thing, you know, think about it. In Washington, D.C., out of every dollar spent by the federal government today, more than 40 cents is borrowed. We are running up massive amounts of debt. This administration has doubled down on all the things that will make this country even further and further, future generations further and further in debt. As I said, the massive health care expansion, the stimulus bill, you just go right down the list. Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, up until a few months ago, the highest-ranking military official in this country, said repeatedly in testimony before congressional committees that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. He didn't say Iran, he didn't say North Korea, he didn't say Al-Qaeda. He said the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Why? Because we borrow so much money from countries around the world. China is one of our biggest, one of our biggest financiers of that debt. Ladies and gentlemen, we have got to get back to that basic principle which everybody here in North Dakota and South Dakota understands, and that is you can't spend money you don't have. You have to live within your means, and sometimes that means hard decisions. Sometimes that takes courageous leadership. But you've done it here in North Dakota. We've done it in my state of South Dakota, and it's high time we did it in Washington, D.C. You know, the final thing I'll mention, in addition to fiscal responsibility, that I think is a governing principle and a foundational principle for us as Republicans, is a basic belief in personal freedom coupled with personal responsibility. The individual responsibility is an element sometimes that we don't talk a lot about anymore. We like to talk about freedom, but the flip side of that coin is responsibility. And that's why in 1969, Ronald Reagan went to the National Governors Association and advanced and promoted an interesting concept. It was called welfare reform. It got voted down 49-1 in 1969. And it was over 25 years later, in 1996, when finally a Republican Congress was able to pass a transformational program to reform welfare in this country and to put Americans back to work out of a fundamental belief that government should do for those things what people can't do for themselves, those essential things. but there are certain parts of our culture, the fabric of our society, that revolve around that principle of individual responsibility. When we get away from that, we create all kinds of new programs in Washington, D.C. that are designed to help people and do things for people, but we get to the point where people can't help themselves. And we got to remember that the flip side of the coin of personal freedom is individual responsibility, and our policies coming out of our states and our federal government ought to reflect that. You know, there's an old saying, that a government that's big enough to give you everything you want is also big enough to take it all away. And we've got, in many respects, a government that's gotten very big, that's made a lot of promises to people in this country. But there's a flip side to that too. And it's not good for this country or for future generations. When you govern, when you lead with a core set of principles, and when you lead by example, people are willing to respond to that leadership. I couldn't help but think this week, it was 25 years ago in June, when Ronald Reagan went to the Brandenburg Gate, to the Berlin Wall, and said, Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate, tear down this wall. 25 years ago, this June. This week, it was the power and the force of American leadership, anchored in freedom and an understanding that democracy is the best way to liberate people around the world. And yet this week, we had an American president meeting with a Russian leader saying, you know what, I'll have a lot more flexibility after the election. And then having that leader say, I'll go tell Vladimir. What a contrast. What a contrast. What a contrast we have in these types of leadership. Two very different styles of leadership. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen? You can't be in leadership unless you're in the arena. Now, that doesn't mean you have to put your name on a ballot. Now, you got a big election year here in North Dakota. A lot of people running for office and some very important positions to fill. Starting with the governor, starting with the Senate race, the House race, the constitutional office races, the legislative races. There are so many important races this year. It's important that we get out and support those people who have put their names on the ballot. And that might mean something different for all of us. Not everybody can run for office. That's not what we're all cut out to do. You know, some people, it's writing a check to support a candidate or support a political party. For some people, it may be pounding in yard signs or walking neighborhoods or making phone calls. Those are all essential part of the blocking and tackling that is necessary in successful campaigns. And as we look at the issues on the elections on the ballot this year in North Dakota, it's important to remember that all of them matter. Every election has consequences. Every election matters because you are electing somebody who is going to be a voice for the principles that you believe in. And if you don't think that's true, I will give you an example from my perspective, having been in federal office now for several years. If you look at your congressional delegation, they all held offices that they used to springboard into federal office. Byron Dorgan, Tax Commissioner. Ken Conrad, Tax Commissioner. Earl Pomeroy, Insurance Commissioner. Heidi Heitkamp, Tax Commissioner, Attorney General. You look at all those elections in those offices, we can't take any of them for granted. They all matter. And if we're going to get to 6-0 in the United States Congress from North and South Dakota, we've got to make sure we hold on to those offices that are so important to building that farm team and that next generation of federal office holders. I got asked all the time when I was, in Washington, why can't we elect more Republican senators from South Dakota? You know what I tell them? Because we continue to elect Democrats to the House of Representatives. In the last 50 years in South Dakota, there hasn't been one United States senator that has been elected that didn't first serve in the House of Representatives. Every one of these offices, every one of these elections matter. You know, my wife and I, we went through a couple of Senate elections, as Jack mentioned. In the first one in 2002, I lost by 524 votes. And that number is pretty well etched. 524 24 votes. And people would come up to me afterwards and say, if I'd known it was going to be that close, I would have voted, I would have got somebody else to vote. But you think about what that translates into in terms of just every little precinct. We had somewhere on the order of 12 or 1,300 precincts in South Dakota. You lose a race that close, all that means is one more vote, less than one vote per precinct. But I remember sitting in the living room with Kimberly after that election, and it's hard fought, expensive, bare knuckles campaign. And we were sitting in our living room, she looks at me and she said, I am not going through another campaign unless God himself comes to the door and says you have to run.
Thank you, God.
I said, yeah. I said, I don't think that's going to happen, honey. But you know, the funny thing about it was, several months passed, and anybody who's been through campaigns, and by the way, spouses take it harder than anybody when you go through a campaign. I think the candidates sort of know what the risks are. But you gain some perspective, you learn lessons from losing. And we were sitting in our living room several months later, and she looked at me and she said, you know, I finally realized and concluded that what we went through in losing that election wasn't just about the winning. It was about the race. Wait a minute. For me, it was about the winning, you know. I'm very competitive. But it was an important point. What she was saying was, you know what? It's important that we be out there in the arena fighting for the things that we believe in. And yes, it'd be nice if we win, but the important thing is to be in the arena. And ladies and gentlemen, we have got to be in the arena. Because the stakes are high. Stakes are high, and the consequences are great. We don't get it right. Future generations are going to pay the price. And I don't want it ever to be said of our generation that we were the generation that let down the next generation when it came time to pass that torch of freedom. Our legacy to the next generation ought to be freedom. Ronald Reagan once said that each generation is only, or I should say every generation is only one step removed from extinction. You have to be willing to fight and defend freedom at every opportunity. It can't be passed on the bloodstream. It has to be fought for and handed down for our children to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children's children what it was once like to live in the United States of America, where men were free. Freedom is important. Elections matter. Elections have consequences. This year in North Dakota, it's important that you get out there and make sure that we are electing principled, hardworking conservatives to Congress, to the State House, and up and down the ballot. God bless you and make it.